Welcome viewers, welcome Professor Pant. So for just as the bio, Professor Pant is Vice President at Observer Research Foundation and also a Professor of International Relations at King's College London. So this session will delve into a review of Professor Pant's 2016 book on Indian foreign policy and overview. And we will try to understand how has Indian foreign policy evolved in this space between 2016 and 2022. So Professor Pant, I'm Asish, and I would like to welcome you to the Geostrata.
Thank you, Ashish. Thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this excellent job that you are doing, and all of you, you and your team. I look forward to having this conversation.
Fantastic. Looking forward as well. So Professor Pant, I would like to understand what do you think, in what terms or in around what contours has Indian foreign policy evolved since the time you wrote that book? And if you were to write that book today, what amends would you make to that book?
See, I think that book was primarily written, as the title says, an overview of, very broad overview of, Indian foreign policy as it was evolving till then, and certainly I think the idea was to capture broad trends both in terms of different geographies, different partnerships, and different some thematic areas. So it was kind of a broader narrative around India's changing expectations from the world and world's changing expectations from India, and I think. If you look at the world today, certainly in 2022, the world looks so very different compared to even in 2016 when that book came out. So I think some significant amendments would be needed. But I think the broad theme remains perhaps what I had articulated in the introduction, that we are looking at an India that is much more confident. We are looking at an India that is much more able to articulate its view of the world and engage with its external interlocutors as an equal, less and less of defensiveness in India's posture, and more confidence in the in the way India has been engaging with the world for the last, I think, decade or more. And that has that confidence we do not see change. I think the trend line continues. But what I would sort of focus on are two aspects. One, international environment has changed dramatically, right? So you will have to accommodate that change if one were to write that book or one were to articulate the same themes that one was doing in 2016, because the world has changed and that would have to be somewhere in the mix. And of course, India itself is also changing. So the kind of conversations India is having today with itself within its own boundaries. So kind of negotiations, the kind of engagements that India is having in domestic foreign policy discourse within the community as Indians. I think that is an important aspect as well, that you see. Just to give you an example, you are a first-year-old undergrad with a lot of interest in IR. And there is an entire generation that is now coming up that is quite interested in international relations. I don't remember any other time. I studied international relations as a kid, but not as a kid, but I was a kid in my when I was studying in my master's. But I think the scale at which India's youth today engages with the ideas on international affairs on international platform has changed considerably, and that you see in your day-to-day interactions, but also in the way I think even a section of Indians respond to small things like when Prime Minister visits abroad or when there is some event that pertains to India. I think there's a lot of interest. You see that in your media conversations, in your day-to-day conversations. So I think two things would have to be accounted for. One, that international environment has changed, and the other is domestic political evolution, domestic discourse evolution in India.
That covers a lot of things, Professor. And also that brings me to recent developments in the international order. So it is being said that the international order is not responding recently. as compared to the global financial crisis of 2008. We saw the G20 met, a lot of discussions happened, and we could arrive at a framework so as to minimize these 2020 with the pandemic, with the war in Ukraine, uh, with the food inflation, things are not moving the way in which they should. So in this context, if we consider the role of international institutions like the IMF, which recently allegedly begged India to lift up the weight ban or do something about it, but then recently the USA, I mean, Biden lost a golden opportunity to sort of lift up sanctions so that Putin and Russia could allow the export of wheat to control inflation, all of that thing. So in this, what could be the IMF's response to this thing? Or is there a dichotomy between like in how international institutions respond to some set of countries and in a way that is not equal? So there is this inequality, and how should India go about navigating it to influence this compass towards in a way that favors Indian national interest?
See, one thing is very important to underline is that international relations by definition is unequal, right? So you have major powers, you have middle powers, you have small powers, you have countries, that are small countries, developing countries, poor countries, weak countries, and international order generally takes a lot of time to respond to their aspirations. The international system is dominated by major powers, power projection. Those countries that have the ability to project power often get the most from the international system, and therefore, one of the most singular determinant of global politics is how states try to accumulate as much power as possible, because for them that is a means to serving their interests better. Now, I think what has happened in the international context today is something very fundamental. That we are almost at an inflection point in the evolution of the post-Second World War II international order. The assumptions, the institutions, the frameworks, the norms, the values that I think that were there and that laid the foundation of this entire institutional architecture post-Second World War is being challenged from all sides. So it's not it's not unnatural that we are witnessing the withering away of existing institutions. I mean, just to you talk of IMF, but you can go back and see IMF has always been very contested. But think of a platform or an institution like WTO or WHO, World Health Organization. Now, for a lot of scholars, for a lot of observers, health is one area where it is very easy, or seemingly it was very easy to see how countries can work with each other and reach win-win outcomes. Everyone wants stability in global health scenario, and why would you want to hamper any country from achieving health standards or information about health practices across the world? I mean, this was considered as one of the low-hanging fruits of global cooperation. But what happens when COVID-19 hit us? I think the world recognized that even an institution like WHO can be so corrupted and can be manipulated to an extent where China did not allow the WHO to release relevant information for months. And here you had the head of the WHO trying to protect China for a very long time. So I think that the argument, that institutional fabric of the world is withering away is a very valid one, and it is withering away. The institutional fabric is getting weaker by the day. I think because of the changing structural situation in the world, that you have a power like China that is rising and that is determined to make its mark on global politics, even if it means crushing the existing institutional frameworks, even if it means moving away from the centrist consensus, etc. And on the other hand, you have America that had for long been a fulcrum of institutional arrangements in the world post-Second World War, find itself in a unique position that it is not only a relatively declining power, but also a country that is polarized, a country where there is no consensus on what American foreign policy should be going forward. There is an inward orientation in foreign policy. There is an expectation that America should serve Americans first and then think about the rest of the world. And I think that creates all sorts of confusions. Mr. Trump Trump's victory in American elections highlighted that, but Mr. Biden's continuation has in no way told the world that Mr. Biden or America are going to change course from the Trumpism that we saw for the last several years. So I think we are in a very unique situation where the changing power balance in the international environment is also making it difficult for our institutions to work. And that is what is being reflected in all the institutions, whether it's WHO, WTO, IMF, and others.
Makes sense, exactly. The institutional fabric is withering away. And that brings me to the Indo-Pacific. Now, India's response in the Rise in a Dialogue as well, we have all heard Dr. Jaishankar's speech, and he continuously drew attention to how did the world react in Afghanistan, or very regional issues, saying that if the Ukraine crisis is of primacy, then these issues should also be considered equally important. So in that spirit, in the Indo-Pacific, we saw the Quad met recently. Biden proposed the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And like that was in the spirit of getting all these nations together and forming a coherent answer to the RCEP, as a lot of columnists have been arguing. So do you think Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or rather the wider spirit or the notion behind that, could stand the test of time, considering the way it has been presented? Like the Geostrata has released a statement on it, and we feel that it is a very watered down version of what Biden had initially proposed. So how do you see India navigating its leadership in the Indo-Pacific when we see a US which is not ready to take charge in this region?
See, I don't think that America is not willing to take charge. I think one of the things that Biden's continued focus on Indo-Pacific, the fact that this Quad meeting happened, the fact that weeks before this meeting, Secretary of State Blinken was visiting Southeast Asian countries, is to underscore that while the crisis in Ukraine is continuing, America has no intention of moving away from the Indo-Pacific. I think Americans know that Indo-Pacific is the center of gravity of global politics. Americans know that China's rise is going to be the most important strategic challenge, and they have to respond to it. So there is no question about not having a stake in what is happening. The question is whether in the alternatives that they are proposing, as you point out, will be able to manage that transition, or will they be able to give America the kind of space that America needs in the Indo-Pacific? And there, I think questions certainly can arise and do arise about the feasibility of some of these proposals, about the direction in which they are going. But again, the fact that America has finally come out with an Indo-Pacific economic framework underscores the reality that for America has recognized the challenge that they face in the Indo-Pacific. It's not simply a strategic challenge, that you have a Quad for it, and then you start investing your military might with AUKUS and other platforms. But what you also need in the Indo-Pacific is a stable economic arrangement which can challenge, if not challenge, then provide a credible alternative to what China is doing. China is clearly the dominant economic player in the Indo-Pacific at the moment, and you cannot have a geopolitical framework in Indo-Pacific without a geo-economic framework. And that is, I think, a recognition that America has come to finally. It is late, but nonetheless, they have come to recognize this. And therefore, they are moving towards that with the Indo-Pacific economic framework. The challenge that America faces is that in order to do something as dramatic as a trading bloc, for example, like RCEP is, they need domestic consensus. But in America, if you talk of trade, tariff reduction and trade liberalization, you would have no political future. The left and the right in American domestic politics are completely against any kind of trade liberalization that would allow foreign companies to come in, and particularly Chinese companies to come in and set shop once again. So I think the mood in the US has changed. And of course, Biden administration can only do what their domestic politics will allow. So therefore, what they have come up with is it's not a, I would not call it, underwhelming. I think they've come up with between the constraints that they face in domestic politics and the challenge that they face in the Indo-Pacific, they have come up with a median response. And that response is that, look, we will work on providing the rules of the game on economic matters, economically defined very, very broadly. This is about, trade facilitation. It is not about tariff reduction. It is about climate change, energy decarbonization. It is about supply chain resilience. It is about infrastructure and connectivity. How it is about digital commerce. So how do you set the rules and standards for many of these domains going forward? And America is saying that we will do it with other like-minded countries in the region. And if they are able to get traction on this, I think this is going to be an important move. If, again, it's a big if, but I think it allows them that leverage of engaging with other powers and to set norms and standards for the region. If they are able to do this, if they are quick off the ground and able to deliver, then I think they have a good space to suggest to the region that they are still in charge, that they are still leading, and that they are still working with like-minded countries to provide regional governance. If they are not, then I'm afraid China is clearly going to be the winner, and it's already far ahead on trade and commerce. So I think we have, the challenge for America is, can America with its like-minded partners provide an alternative framework to regional power partners? And that's what I think the ambition is. We will see how it pans out.
Thank you, Professor. And so we have talked a bit about US's domestic politics, and that reminds me of something interesting. So a lot of commentators, observers have been anticipating a return of Trump in the US in the next elections. If that were to happen, how would US policy change at all, or is this rot institutional that we see, like a lack of initiative on part of the US, or a lack of space on part of the US in taking the lead, at least in the Indo-Pacific? Of course, they do recognize that they have to take the lead. But then if Trump comes back, or if something like a Trumpist candidate comes back, what changes can India expect, and how would that play out for India's national interest?
See, Ashish, I don't think Mr. Trump is coming back, to be very honest. I think he faces a number of problems in most recent primaries in the Republican Party. We have seen the candidates who he was supporting lose to other Republicans. So I think there is a growing Republican movement against him. He retains his base, but I don't think that base is good enough for him to propel him back to office, especially if these legal cases, this January 6th riots that happened and the investigation that is going on. All of these are hanging around his neck like an albatross. I find it very difficult to conceive of a situation where he's going to make a very significant comeback, unless, of course, the Republicans and the Democrats really mess it up. Now, on the issue of, the broader issue that you raised remains very valid, that Mr. Trump may not be there, but Trumpism has survived. And even Mr. Biden is carrying on, I think, number of policies which relate to Mr. Trump. And I think on China in particular, Mr. Biden has carried forward Mr. Trump's legacy. The only thing that Biden administration talks about is multilateralism and taking others along. But I think if you look at it carefully, America's China policy today is reflective of what Biden, how Trump changed it. Trump made it more coercive. Trump made it more competitive. Trump made China clearly as an adversary, and I think that policy continues. So I'm not that skeptical of a dramatic shift in America's Indo-Pacific policy, even if someone like Mr. Trump comes to office. I think what we are witnessing now is a significant consolidation in American politics on the issue of China and what to do about it. Sometimes, and if you look at successive administrations in the US, and you can go all the way back to George W. Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, one thing that they have in common, or they have, their foreign policy outreach has had in common, is this outreach to India. You go back to Mr. Trump, and when Mr. Trump had come to office, people here in India were all despondent. Oh my God, what will he do? What will happen to us? Indian national interest will suffer. He will ask India to do this. He'll ask India to do that. But in the end, he turned out to be a relatively good friend. I think Indians Generally, Indian foreign policy did not face much pressure from him. In fact, on all the issues that were critical to India, whether it was Chabahar port, whether it was S-400, we continued to get exemptions. And on China, in fact, we were able to generate a lot of momentum because he was the first one to come up with the free and open Indo-Pacific policy, right? So, and then of course there was Mr. Biden, and again, when Mr. Biden had come to office, there were many in India who were complaining what will happen. Will he talk about human rights? Will he take a different position? And on the state of Indian democracy, etc., etc. But you see today, India is perhaps one of the most frequently engaged country by the US on all issues. So while there might be differences even on Ukraine, there are differences with the US, but those differences have not been allowed to, to make the strategic convergence marginal. And I think that's the real story of India-US relationship, that despite changing administrations in Washington and despite changing governments in India and New Delhi, there has been a growing convergence between these two countries. And my own sense is that this is only likely to accelerate if the present structural changes in the region continue.
Thank you, Professor. So you have raised a very excellent insight in terms of how the foreign policy or the foreign policy orientation of USA, of India towards each other, these have evolved structurally, and how even the influence of domestic politics can only influence it so much, not more than that. So I think that explains a lot in terms of continuities and adjustments. And I'll bring you to Taiwan in a moment. So we saw the Ukraine war, like it happened in a succession from 2014, then a lot of pronouncements, etc., from both sides. Recently, we noticed an audio got leaked from some military general meeting of the PLA, and they said they were planning to attack Taiwan. If that happens, should India toe the same line that it did in the Ukrainian crisis, Ukrainian war, or would it be different? Should it be different, especially when we consider how assertive Indian foreign policy has become under Prime Minister Modi, EM Jaishankar? And I think that's a good thing. We think that's a good thing. So how could India react in case of a tentative invasion of Taiwan?
It's very, I think, an important question, perhaps in the context of what is happening in the world. And my own sense would be, and I believe that India should be doing much more when it comes to Taiwan. We should be much more vocal, and we should be engaging Taiwan at a much higher level than we are doing today. I think there is no reason why we should not be upping the ante on Taiwan a bit with China. Of course, with China it's a difficult management because it's your neighbor who has a lot of grievances against you. It has lots of capabilities that you have to manage very carefully. But I think graduated acceleration in India's engagement with Taiwan is needed. And recent changes have opened up new possibilities, whether it is on trade, whether it is on semiconductor industry, for example, with Taiwan. There are new opportunities that are there, and we should be tapping them into as the supply chains shift from China. India and Taiwan should be working much more closely on a range of issues. Now, when it comes to, I think, invasion of Taiwan, and I do, there are two things. One, I think what is happening in Ukraine and what is happening, Ukraine and Taiwan are two different kinds of theaters. So first, let me talk very briefly on I think the debate. I think the debate in China perhaps is more of a cautionary tale about what Russians have done in Ukraine, right? Imagine if the same fate would fall on China, China would be even a bigger loser than what Russia is today. Because China, unlike Russia, China is fully integrated into the global economy. China is it is a trading country. It is a country that is whose fate is interwoven with the larger global economic order. It really cannot afford isolation the way Russia can. Russia was never integrated, barring McDonald's and barring coffee shops from the West. Russia was largely a country where the elite viewed engagement with the West beneficial. But largely people were still, if you look at Russia's engagement with the West, it was Russia's economy primarily relying on oil and gas, It is, but there is no comparison with China. China is a fully integrated economy, so the loss for China would be quite substantial. And perhaps if the lessons from Ukraine are coming to the fore, they are coming to the fore that look, perhaps for Russia it was a mistake to underestimate the West, because perhaps Mr. Putin thought that Europe in particular is going to be the weaker entity. They will never be put their house in order. They will be divided, so there will be no action against us. But look at the economic consequences of what Mr. Putin has done to Russia. Now, if you map those consequences to China, I don't think Chinese government would have any incentive to do what the Russians are doing. Now, certainly the problem in China is that Xi Jinping has raised the ante on Taiwan so much that people are even speculating that perhaps 2027 would be the year before which they have to target Taiwan. They will try to take Taiwan back. And certainly in the context of Xi Jinping, you can always, in the case of all autocratic leaders, there is always a danger that if the domestic situation is not going well, which it is not going for China at the moment, the rates of growth are down, there is domestic discontent, there is even the political confusion at times. We see news reports of contests between Li Keqiang and Xi Jinping, the prime minister. So there are these, the things that are not going right for China, including the COVID management. That can be a big reason for the domestic pressures on Xi Jinping and Communist Party to target Taiwan, because that's one issue on which the Communist Party would be able to mobilize the Chinese. So there is a danger there. But I still think that the lessons from Ukraine for China are multifaceted. They are not, and I think they are going to be, they perhaps lead to greater caution than they lead to greater adventurism. But if that happens, if Chinese do attack Taiwan, I would hope that India takes a strong, robust stand and stands up for Taiwan, because ultimately it's simply not a question of Taiwan. It's also a question of what is happening in consequences for the Indo-Pacific, for consequences for India's own border dispute with China, consequences for the larger normative shift. And if you see the statements from India on Ukraine, how they have evolved from a position where India started, when the conflict started, India was reluctant to say anything. And as the conflict has escalated, India has said that we have to be, set certain norms like territorial integrity and sovereignty, a UN Charter, international law should be at the heart of this conversation, which is clearly meant that Russia is not doing that. And of course, if you take that argument to its logical conclusion in the context of Taiwan, you know where India should be standing.
We do know where India should be standing. Thank you for this context, Professor. And we would like to end with one last question. We are talking a lot about how domestic policy is spilling over or projecting into foreign policies of nations, of countries. So in that spirit, in our neighborhood in the last 1 year, we have seen, or since post-COVID, we have seen governments changing in a lot of countries. Myanmar, there's a crisis in Sri Lanka, the PM has resigned. In Pakistan, there's a crisis, the PM has changed. So there is a lot of instability in this sense. So how do these changes, these transitions in power determine or change or affect India's foreign policy calculus? Because we do sense that there is a lot of disruption which comes along with the change in leadership, especially in our neighborhood, which is like most of the nations there are crisis ridden at this point. Some are going through a debt crisis, some are going through a political crisis, all these things. So could you briefly touch upon any of these countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, or anything, and explain us how is that affecting India's calculus and the way forward?
I think the neighborhood is a very important, I mean, for any country, neighborhood is important. And I think for India in particular, being in this very, very volatile neighborhood, it's always important to ensure that, your engagement with your neighbors is not only sustainable or sustained, but also it engages all stakeholders. And I think therefore for India, there are two things. One, this question is often raised, right, by many in the West, that why doesn't India stand up for democracy, and that you have Myanmar, there, which is not a democratic country, and India has taken a muted stand. But India's dilemmas are different with the neighborhood, because you really have your national interests at stake. Whoever is governing these countries, you have to have a workable relationship. The West can afford to isolate Myanmar, but India can't, because India has to deal with Myanmar on a day-to-day basis for its northeastern insurgency, for trafficking going on along the border management issues. How do you ensure that that channel of communication remains open with your counterparts in the neighborhood? And also, of course, the larger point that China's presence in the neighborhood has also made it imperative for India to continue to engage with these countries. If India is not engaging, China will engage. It already is engaging, and China will be the most important player in these countries. Is this in the interest of India? No, certainly not. But is this in the interest of the Western countries? Certainly not. So I think there is for India, the engagement with its neighbors is a priority. Therefore, you see, irrespective of governments, neighborhood is given a primary position. Even this government has said neighborhood first. And there is a lot of interaction with the neighborhoods. If you see, I think if you map out prime ministers and foreign ministers' trips, you would find that neighborhood occupies a lot of big place in that matrix. So in a sense, that is something that should happen. That is very natural. That is important for India. But also a reflection of how things are evolving in India's neighborhood, because you have the presence of China in a big way in India's neighborhood. And if India is not continuously engaged, if India is for a moment goes on a back foot or on the defensive, the costs can be quite high for India, as we saw, for example, what happened in the case of Sri Lanka, where Hambantota was offered to India. We didn't take that offer. It went to the Chinese, and look at the consequences. Not only you have a situation where China got a leg hold in Sri Lanka, but you also then saw the consequences which are being reflected today, that the debt crisis escalated in Sri Lanka and leading to a major economic and political crisis for Sri Lanka. So I think at some level for our neighborhood, inaction is not an option. India has to be constantly engaged. India has to be constantly on the vigil. India has to constantly make a point that, look, India is going to do its best to ensure that the neighbors are converging with India, or they have a convergent viewpoint. Now, of course, it's not going to be easy. Neighbors, India is a big country. Our neighbors are small countries. They always have this paranoia of India as a big brother that is going to overshadow them, that's going to dictate terms to them. So India has to be very nimble and humble in ensuring that its interests are protected. At the same time, its engagement with the stakeholders remains wide and both broad and deep. And I think you do see that recognition now in India, that neighborhood is important. But here I would end with one caveat, which I think is a very important one. And since we started from the book, I would also want to end on that. Look, one of the central features of Indian foreign policy, you pick up any book, any document, if it's an overview, it's going to be Pakistan. The India-Pakistan problem, India-Pakistan relationship had always been the central narrative. I think what the last 7 or 6 years of Indian foreign policy have shown to the world is that India can marginalize Pakistan, India can isolate Pakistan, and it won't have any impact on India's foreign policy trajectory globally. India can thrive. This is a counter to the argument that was often used to be made in the past that, look, you have to engage with Pakistan. Pakistan is your neighbor. There is no option. You can't change your friends. But I think what we have shown in the last few years, or not we, but the government has shown, is that you can marginalize and disengage with Pakistan. It will not have any consequence for your own global posture, because India is structurally a far more important country, a much bigger country. Our aspirations should be much higher than Pakistan. So this constant fascination with Pakistan did great damage to Indian foreign policy over the last 60 years, I would say. And the marginalization of Pakistan in Indian foreign policy discourse is a good thing.
It's indeed a good thing, Professor. Thank you so much. And to summarize this interview to our viewers, I would just say this is a time of great international churning in the geopolitical atmosphere that we are living in, and to find a place to navigate itself through all of this through the cloud and mist. I think we need to draw out the contours of how we want to engage with the world. What are our priorities? Which certainly it is not countries which export terrorism or which are responsible for killing of innocents or things like that, or responsible for, let's say, illicit trade or trafficking. Not that. So I think we need to stand for good, and we need to be on the vigil for what comes next in terms of churning or changes in the Indo-Pacific or in Taiwan, etc. So on this note, we would like to thank Professor Pant for coming and taking our time for this interview. So thank you so much, Professor Pant, once again, and we wish you all the very best for your evening.